So clear. Okay, let us go ahead and get started. We hope you had a great spring break and welcome back. We very much look forward to this next stage of the course. We'll be saying a few more words about that momentarily, but first let me mention all of you should have received a copy of the final paper prompt. I half jokingly in our first class said the prompt will be something along the lines of discuss something that maybe in some ways kind of is related to something that maybe was mentioned in class, and I said that may sound like an exaggeration, but it's really not. Now you see, we truly meant it. That is basically the assignment. We are simply asking you to wrestle with something in some ways related to the class. This can be an idea, a conflict, a set of tensions, a set of texts, anything related to the larger topics and concerns of the class. We are absolutely open to whatever this will take in terms of either its form or its content. We want you to take chances. We want you to think big. Remember, this is a class in which we have ludicrously jumped across millennia and across entire continents. So if we are comfortable doing this, well, if we are willing to do this, and the fact that you are willing to be part of this journey with us means that we are very open to you seeing this as a sort of prompt where you can also think big in whatever ways you find powerful and hopefully also challenging. You probably will not write a flawlessly perfect, coherent paper. Of course not. If you're wrestling with tough questions, you will be wrestling with tough questions. We are happy to see that. Don't feel I need to deal with something really easy, tight, and understandable so I can write the kind of paper that most professors in most classes are looking for. We kind of want you to do the exact opposite. We want you to think big, and if the result is a tension-filled, difficult, messy paper, great. So this is up to you, and we want you to think of it this way. It is also not, I'm sure this is clear, but I'll say it anyway, this is not a research paper. You are welcome to do research if that is helpful for your project. But we are not in any way looking for that. We do not expect you to spend the next several weeks going through and doing a tight research on some topic. Any research you would want to do would only be if it's helpful. In all likelihood, none will be, because this is mainly a thought piece, and we've already given you a lot of pretty tough texts, and so you probably have enough to work with already. So we are open to anything. We just want you to think big and wrestle with whatever piece of anything kind of related to this course has proved to you exciting, powerful, and challenging.
Both form and content are open.
Completely open.
Because
Yes.
really, the exam is an invitation to develop your own voice and your own position with respect to the broad range of topics addressed in the course. You are free to consult with one another to show your drafts to anyone inside or outside the course. The only restraint on collaboration is the normal restraint in intellectual life that of the final product you'll be able to say in good faith that it's largely the expression of your own mind. The one dogmatic restriction is no machines. So AI is out. Humanity is in.
And let me underline that point. ChatGPT, which I'm embarrassed to say, I'm very much a Luddite in this respect. I've not used it yet. However, I've seen many people who have used it to show you the output. And more importantly, I've talked to people who actually understand what's going on. And ChatGPT seems amazing, but the way ChatGPT works is it is simply a statistical model to guess what the next word should be when it's writing sentences based upon is this massive, massive database. And the key technological breakthrough was simply building computers or building programs that could work with this unbelievable database. So we will be talking today a lot about the degree to which we can fall into patterns that can define define our entire lives, our ways of thinking. That's literally what
Every source.
ChatGPT is.
The source of data are what the world is already
Exactly.
saying. That's more
Precisely.
interesting to know what the world is not yet saying.
Exactly. It is literally giving you the most patterned possible way of thinking, because it's a statistical model saying what is the dominant way that people are thinking in all of the database that this software has access to, and it's giving you the statistically most patterned, most dominant way of thinking. So it's sort of the exact opposite of what we want you to be doing for this class and hopefully for your lives. Yeah, it's chilling the degree to which people are now relying on this so much, as if this is giving us good thinking. It is literally not giving you thinking, it is giving you the most statistically patterned way of thinking in the database, meaning all existing text that it so far has access to. So, if you ever want to use it, be aware that is what you're getting.
Any questions about this?
Yeah, any questions about this? Fantastic. So, think big, challenge yourself. I know in most courses you've ever taken, you'll be told to follow the sort of standard introductory paragraph saying, this paper will be about the following point, and I will make the following three discussions, and then conclude by showing my hypothesis, and then you give those 3 points, and then you have the conclusion saying, this shows what I said I would do in the introduction. And then oftentimes you do the real thinking when you're not writing such absurd papers. Needless to say, you do not need to write that kind of a paper here. We are open to anything, absolutely, including both form and content. So, think big, and we very much look forward to reading all of your works. So, let us then jump in, and let me quickly explain where we are in the course and where we will be going in these last few weeks. So, we are now turning to the last of the big philosophical / religious modes of thinking that we are calling the ethic of connection. And we will do so along the lines of the ways we have done it for the previous ones we have thus far analyzed. We will begin with the earliest formulations of what is, at least in our opinion, the most powerful formulation in the early period. We will discuss it at length, and then in the subsequent session, in this case next week, we will then turn to how we could rethink and reconstitute this religion and this philosophical idea for the contemporary world. In this case, our argument will be that it's in early Confucianism that you see the powerful, we would argue, vision of what an ethic of connection would be. Our goal will be to begin with that early formulation, asking what is it that they are trying to say. When we hit ideas, and boy will we, that we find very objectionable, the question is, okay, but if they're challenging our assumptions, what can we learn from that challenging? Even if ultimately we will disagree, still, that challenging will be incredibly important. That will be the project today. Beginning next week again, we will try to reconstitute it just as we did earlier with the self-fashioning model. What would it mean? Seeing the dangers it's fallen into, how could it be reconstituted? After that, we will spend some time comparing the two in subsequent weeks, asking if both of these in their reconstituted forms are incredibly powerful, and yet if they seem to be fundamentally at odds, and they in many places will be fundamentally at odds, what do we do? Do we try to come up with a synthesis? We will, say, argue against some kind of an easy synthesis that will take out the power of either. Do we use each to challenge the other? We'll certainly argue yes, but then what will be the implications? And we will wrestle with that in full. And then, of course, at the end, we will, I smile as I say this, we will conclude the class, which will be a non-conclusion, hopefully a conclusion in a very opening sense that will allow us to ask questions as we will all continue going forward to wrestle with all of these issues. So that is a brief sense of where we've been and where we are going. Let us now jump back again 2,000 years. So as we have said, for each of these ones that we have been looking at, we will begin in this extraordinary moment of world history, roughly halfway through the first millennium BCE, when, as we have noted, you have what they saw, and we would certainly agree in historical retrospect, was a couple of millennia of these Bronze Age, very hierarchical societies in which literally everything was defined by birth. So for millennia, you had Bronze Age societies across all of Eurasia, everything was defined in a ranked hierarchy based upon birth. The high aristocracy controlled all land and all resources. Monarchy was usually some form of simply the most powerful aristocratic family who would hold power as long as they could maintain the support of the other aristocratic families, and whatever minor so change would occur would oftentimes be simply one lineage taking over the monarchy from another lineage. And meanwhile, everyone born below the aristocracy was ranked all the way down to the commoners who would be working the fields for the aristocrats. It is staggering how long that lasted, again, millennia. And when that begins to fall over the course of the first millennium BCE, as we've noted, you get this extraordinary flourishing of these religious and philosophical ideas. Since we're in America, which traces its history back to the West, obviously most commonly we'll be talking about the explosion that happens in ancient Greece with figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But as we've already seen, this was equally true throughout the Near East. It absolutely was true in South Asia. We discussed Buddhism and Jainism, albeit briefly, as well as the Upanishads. And of course, on the eastern end of Eurasia, the exact same thing is going on. This is the period when you get figures like Confucius, Mencius, Zhuangzi, Lao Tzu, Xunzi, who will come up with a very, very different articulation of what to do. However, all of these people going across all of Eurasia, who certainly did not know each other, they did have common concerns. All of them felt that the world that we had been living in for 2 millennia was horrible. All of them wanted to bring that to an end. All of them wanted to pose the big questions that we are trying to wrestle with in this class. How would we build a better world? How do we live life in a flourishing way? What would that even mean to do so? What do we rethink and how do we rethink it? What was the problem? What are our common assumptions in the world that led to this horrible period of human history? How do we begin again, and what would that mean? As we have seen, however, despite the common set of concerns, the answers have been radically different. So today, let us turn to that eastern side of Eurasia and look at the ideas particularly coming out of Confucianism, although we'll touch a bit on Taoism in a few places, and discuss at the time what that vision was, and then again next week we will turn to a reconstitution of it for what it might mean in the contemporary period. So, let us jump back 2,000 years. The figure of Confucius lived in roughly midway through the first millennium BCE, so he's a rough contemporary of Socrates and the Buddha. We know not a whole lot about him as a human being. We know that he tried to have a political career, was relatively successful, and at a certain point decided he was not going to make the big difference in the political realm, and spent the rest of his life as a teacher. In terms of his own social background, he was part of what really now is the group that we would look back and call the philosophers of early China. He is part of this group born below the aristocracy who, by becoming literate, learning to read and write, debating policy, are hoping to be hired in these developing states. And that group begins posing the questions we were mentioning before. Some of them will indeed go on to have very successful political careers. Many, like Confucius, will be very unhappy with the way these states are developing and will refuse to be a part of them. However, it's precisely this group that will say, we want to break down this hierarchy, we want to rethink the world. Confucius is one of these. We pick him up in terms of his philosophy at that last period of his life, when he is literally a teacher, teaching the next generation how to grow. He wrote very little according to the tradition, so this is true of the Buddha and Socrates as well. We have primarily, in terms of what the philosophy is, the text that you read for today, the Analects, which undoubtedly you found, and this was absolutely, as we will see later, part of the point, a very challenging text. It literally consists of statements that Confucius made to his disciples. The text claims to be written by the disciples after Confucius has passed away, writing down what he said. The statements are given with almost no context, and the tradition then consists of trying to work out what that philosophy was. So as I give it to you, I will be building upon those writings from the next 2 centuries, trying to give an explanation of what it was Confucius was doing. And from there, we'll discuss what the central tenets of Confucianism were. So, to begin with these opening concerns that, as I've said, were really shared across all of these movements in the first millennium BCE, all of these religious and philosophical attempts to rethink the world. Confucius was deeply concerned with the fact that all of us have a tendency to grow up in a world that we come to accept as simply natural. This is simply the way the world is. And that's true for us as human beings. I am simply who I am. The world is what it is. This social organization is what it is. I am who I am. And once you are thinking that way, of course it means there's an incredible complacency built into our life, which of course is what allows 2 millennia to go by in which these social hierarchies are almost unchanging, with a minor shift of what aristocratic lineage happens to control the monarchy at any given time. However, his solution to this is a rather distinct one when it's compared with the other movements coming on. To begin a comparison that we'll be developing over the next several weeks, the one that has become dominant in America, building out of what we have argued is a very domesticated and not terribly powerful rereading of the self-fashioning tradition, that model in essence goes along the following lines. It is all about the radical self breaking from the bonds of the social world. So you're being trained to think of the social world as a structure that holds you back, and the self is that which breaks from it. Either, as we saw in the high romantic version of this, endless just breaking by the unique self against these structures, or in the domesticated American version, where it's much more the sense that all of us have some self already there that we're born with, and so the goal is to look within, find your true self, learn to love and embrace your true self, live your life according to what is best for you as a true self, find a career that fits what you are inherently good at and does not play into things you're not already inherently good at, and somehow that is what allows us to break from structures that would hold us back in the limited sense that at least we fit into the structured world in a way that works best for who we truly are. Either of these, either the domesticated American version or the more radicalized romantic version, from a Confucian point of view, as we will see, will be seen as not just wrong, but dangerous and intriguingly encapturing in a very strong sense. So let me begin by explaining Confucian understandings of the self and of the world. And let me actually begin with the world before we turn to the self, because it turns out these are both the same, and we misunderstand both. So, looking at the world, is the world, as we've discussed before, as the Greeks were seeing it, a pre-structured cosmos that we need to fit ourselves within, or in later versions, endlessly react against? The answer is absolutely no. The degree to which we perceive it that way is the degree to which we mistakenly understand the world, and much more important from the Confucian perspective, mistakenly understand how we should act in that world. What the world really is an endless set of energies that are constantly interacting with each other. Those interactions will form patterns. There's nothing inherently good or bad about those patterns, and as we will see, all patterns are changeable. However, minus the change that we'll be getting to later, there are general tendencies of those patterns that can go on for a very, very long period of time. Let me begin with an obvious one. So we are humans. We can categorize different types of energies to help us understand this endless interaction process. And we can call one set of energies yin energies, cold. Another set of energies we can call yang energies, hot. These are our categories. And we can understand one pattern that we have to live with a lot in the world in terms of the interaction of yang and yin. So if these are endless interactions, it means when one becomes too powerful, it inherently will bring about the opposite. So once yin becomes incredibly powerful, it gets incredibly cold. That will bring out its opposite, yang. The two will interact until yang comes to ascendancy. It gets very hot. That brings out its opposite yin, and then yin begins to come into ascendancy until it is fully so. We humans have now designated, for reasons I will be getting to later, that interaction pattern as what we will call seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall. There's nothing inherent in that. Those are just the patterns of the cosmos, the way they currently play out, minus what we, it turns out they will say, have done to it, but we will categorize it that way. Those are not natural laws. Those are patterns that are changeable. Patterns of energies. This, it turns out, is true of everything. We humans are nothing but endless patterns of interactions with everything else. All the time, constantly. Always. When we perceive the world as structured and unchanging is when we fall into danger. Your goal is to keep these interactions going. To give an example that we'll elaborate a little bit later, but just to give you a concrete sense of this, in Chinese medicine, if I have a pain here, it means something is blocking the flow of the energy. So the goal is you want to open that up. Your goal is to use things like acupuncture, exercises. Your goal is to get the energies flowing again. You want energies to be flowing, you want interactions to be occurring, and you want them to be as non-controlled as possible, because control is a stoppage. You want flow, you want interaction. Now, what does all of this mean for human beings, and where do the problems come in? So let me begin with some really mundane examples, and we will see this very consistently. Confucian thinking loves to go to very mundane examples, the argument being that dangerous patterns we tend to fall into, we fall into in our mundane everyday lives, and if we are going to change our lives, it begins in the most mundane aspects of that everyday living. So let me begin with some really mundane examples. Let's imagine you as a very young child. What are you like from a Confucian point of view? Do you have some pre-given true self there that hopefully 20 years later you're going to look within and find, and hopefully with the help of personality tests and tracking systems, you'll find what you're good at and what you're bad at to get a good education according to what is best for you? Absolutely not. What you are like, and intriguingly, this is a powerful point for Confucianism, what everyone is like. We're all identical in this sense as human beings at birth. We are messes of energies. All of us are equally messes of energies. We do not have a true self lurking in there. We do not have different types of intelligence, different types of abilities. We are messes. And then what happens to us when we start growing up is we start, well, interacting with other messes, what we can call other human beings, as well as existing in a world of interactions. And we fall into a few dangers. Let me begin with the first one, which is not a good one, but peanuts compared to the more dangerous ones we fall into. So imagine you're in a room as a very young child, and someone walks in and smiles. You feel happy. In this way of thinking, it's that action, that smile, that drags out from you, to be as literal a translation as I can, drags out from you an energy of happiness that then fills you. So you feel happy because you are filled with an energy of happiness because of this immediate stimulation. Someone smiles. Then someone walks in and yells at you, and you are angry. Meaning, now you'll not be surprised to hear, that action, the scream, drags out from you the energy of anger. You already see one of our dangers. We have a risk as human beings of being purely passive in the world, immediately being pulled by stimuli around us that can completely overfill us in terms of our emotional energies. That's dangerous for all sorts of reasons, as we'll see, but again, peanuts. So let me continue the examples. Someone else then walks in, who for whatever reason reminds you of the previous person who walked in and smiled at you. It can be anything. The walk, the smell of their body, anything will remind you of the previous person who smiled. It will equally drag out from you the energy of happiness. Someone else walks in, and there's nothing mean to you. They're picking up socks or something. But again, for whatever reason, reminds you emotionally of the person who earlier walked in and screamed at you. It equally, that person walking in, picking up the socks in that example, drags out from you an energy of anger. Meaning, and this is where things start getting dangerous, from an incredibly young age, we cease to actually interact with what is really going on around us. We start responding by rote habit. This is the biggest danger for human beings. At least in that first example, we're passive, that's bad enough, but someone is really smiling and someone is really yelling. So that is really going on. In the second set of examples, you're responding by rote. There's no reason to be happy. There's no reason to be angry. It's simply someone doing something that reminds you of something that happened before. Why is this dangerous? Because if all of this is happening at a very young age, imagine a situation which they will say is exactly our situation, where this is what happens as we start growing up all the time. Which means from an incredibly young age, these habits of responding to the world become so ingrained in us, they completely define our relationships. First, with our family members, and then later with friends who we meet, and then much later with the entire world that we will come into interaction with. But we're not really developing relationships. We're relating by rote, habit, and pattern. Pattern in, as we will see, a very dangerous sense, a stable, unchanging sense. These sets of patterns, I should even say, can so define our relationships that they can define everything about us. They define the degree to which we see the world, or more importantly, the fact that we see almost none of the world around us. The degree to which we actually see interactions going on around us, or again, much more importantly, the fact that we see very little of what is really going on around us. We are simply responding to the world by rote pattern. Rote pattern meaning unchanging habit. These habits can become so ingrained in us, we can come over time to think it's just who we are. You could even come to think of them as your personality. And if you wanted to be incredibly dangerous from this point of view, you could even define them as your true self. You could even, if you wanted to be really scary, build an entire social world that would assume that a bunch of habits that we happen to have fallen into are your true self. You could even imagine a situation where we would take personality tests to find out who this true self is, which may be perfectly accurate in terms of finding out who we are, but it's not telling us who your true self is. It's finding what habits you happen to have fallen into by age whatever, 17, 18, 19, when you start taking these personality tests. You could imagine an education system that would track you in terms of what you're inherently good at based upon your true self. And again, the tests, even if they're totally, completely, purely accurate, are testing your true self. They're finding what habits you have fallen into from an incredibly young age that may mean you've gotten really good at math and really bad at reading, for example. The test may accurately pick that up, but that's got nothing to do with you. It's a bunch of habits you've fallen into. And imagine a really dangerous world where we then said, along with tracking to see what you're good at, along with personality tests to see who you really are, we'll develop a whole ethos based upon learning to love and embrace who you really are, because it's just you. And if you have a bad temper, well, that's just who you are. But you should love yourself for who you are and never, ever change. You should use these personality tests to find your concentration and your career. You can even use dating apps to connect you with other true selves who match well. If you're an MPH, you'll match well with a ZHQ, and they can match you so you can have your career, your love life, and your entire mode of being in the world all perfectly matched on this true self. which, needless to say, from a Confucian perspective, would be a nightmare situation. This is not liberatory because what you're really saying, from this point of view, is you are going to define your entire life, your career, your love life, your entire mode of being in the world on a bunch of rote habits you happen to have fallen into in the first 15 to 20 years of your life. This is not what you want to do. So from a Confucian perspective, there is nothing liberatory about this. It in fact is enchaining us into this pre-given vision of the self. What then, from a Confucian perspective, should we be doing if that vision of the true self would be seen as inherently dangerous, just as dangerous, albeit in a very different way, than assuming that the world of a purely hierarchical world where aristocrats are just better human beings than commoners? From this point of view, those are just different types of habits that can become so ingrained in the social world that they can last for centuries, even millennia. So how do you break it? Well, I mentioned we're going to hit some things that will be challenging when we deal with these ideas, and let's begin with one of them. So, there is a statement made by Confucius, one of his many intriguing ones, but he means them, and I think we should take them seriously, agree with them or not, but let's take them seriously and allow them to challenge us, where he explains how we can become good human beings. He'll use terms like a benevolent human being. How do we become benevolent? Well, his statement is we conquer the self by submitting ourselves to ritual. That's how we become good. Now, this may seem like a rather challenging statement being said in contemporary America, where we are so devoted to this notion of the true self that we should be loving and embracing. The last thing you want to do is conquer it, and certainly the last thing you want to do is be submitted to rituals that would tell us what to do, when of course we like to think, I decide my life based upon who my true self is. But note Confucius's argument first on the self. You've already gotten a sense of why he will say, no, you do not want to love and embrace your true self. You want to conquer it. Why? Because what you think of as yourself is a bunch of habits and patterns you have fallen into. Now, we'll see later, that doesn't mean that's all you are, but you need, or rather, you must train yourself to recognize that most of what you think you are probably is just a bunch of habits and patterns. Even what you think of are the good things. I'm good at X. Yeah, you may be. It's because you fall into a habit of being good. Now, you may not want to change that habit, but that has nothing to do with you. Things you're not good at are habits. They are absolutely changeable. The fact that you are XYZ on a personality test, those are a bunch of habits. You want to conquer it. So, if we're going to conquer it, how do we do it? The second part of that sentence may seem the oddest. We submit ourselves to ritual. Now, needless to say, based on everything I've said, you might think that's the last thing in the world we should do. If our danger as human beings is that we fall into these habits that become so ingrained in us that we accept them as simply being who we are, and the social patterns that have become dominant in the social world as just being the way the social world operates, they're just natural, why in the world would being submitted to patterns, rituals, be a way to break that? Wouldn't that just be more patterns and more problems? Well, just as Confucius is pushing our definition of the self, this thing that in his opinion we should conquer, he is going to define ritual very differently than the way we tend to think of ritual, which is very much a post-Protestant looking at ritual from that point of view. So let me discuss Confucius's views of ritual and why, in his opinion, this is a way to begin to alter these patterns that have come to define us. To make the point, let me begin with an example that was developed out of these ideas by Confucians and use that example to articulate what this vision of ritual is that he thinks is potentially very powerful. So to give this ritual, let me take you to that period of time when, again, as we've discussed, you're looking at the breakdown of these old Bronze Age systems But breakdown in the time of Confucius is a beginning part of a process. He is growing up in a world that is still largely defined by heredity, where positions of power are still almost entirely controlled by a landed aristocracy, in which you literally interact with those around you based entirely upon their social rank, and the social rank, again, is based entirely upon heredity. And the most extreme version of this, of course, this is true of any aristocratic line, but since the aristocratic line, the most powerful one, will hold the kingship, it means there is hereditary monarchy. So in the most powerful aristocratic family, the king will be, of course, the head of the most powerful aristocratic family, and the kingship will simply be passed down father to son until another aristocratic family can wrest power from it. So, if you do not find that vision of a world good, and we'll look later to the full political implications of Confucianism, but first from the point of view of ritual, what do you do in terms of breaking down the interest patterns that are playing out? So let me begin with one specific ritual, and then later we'll get to the fuller political implications. But here's the ritual. So in this example, let's imagine you are the king. Since this is a patriarchal system, this means you are male. Let us also assume you have a son who, this being an hereditary system, meaning that son will eventually become the king when you die. And of course, since you are the king, it means you have a father who is now dead, which is why you are now the king. So, before I describe that system in more detail, let me take you through the ritual. You and your son walk to the edge of the ritual space, and you pause. And then you walk in without blushing. Now, that may seem like an absurdly odd example. Why would you be blushing when you walk into the ritual? Here's why. Because you're not you, and your son is not you in that ritual space. Your son is now your deceased father, his deceased grandfather. He is now the ruler. You are the subject, and you are the son of your own son. Your son, he's not your son anymore, walks onto the throne and sits on it. He is now the ruler, and he is your dead father. He looks south, which in China at the time was the ritual direction that the monarch would look. And you, but you're not you anymore, you face north, up, is he sitting up on the throne, up at your own side, but he's not your son, and you pay obeisance to him because you are now his son, and you are now his subject. You act like a proper son would act toward a ruler and a father, as if he were a good ruler and a father, which, again, your own father probably was not always, but nonetheless, and your son obviously isn't, but you must look at him as if he were. And he must look at you, his father, as if you are properly being trained to eventually take his position as a proper son. You then both stand up, and you walk back to the edge of the ritual space, pause, and then you walk out. You then back to being the ruler, and he is back to being the subject. You, of course, are once again the father, and he is once again the son. Why is this ritual being developed by Confucians? Well, let me say a few more words about you and your son before we walk into that ritual space. Finally, you are the ruler. I mean, of course, you're so sad that your father has passed away, but oh my God, for decades, you had to be under that man's shadow? Everyone loved him. Oh, they thought he was this generous, wonderful king with all of these great policies. He was so charismatic. You knew what he was really like. Oh my gosh, he was great on a stage, but then you walk behind that stage and he had a horrible temper. He was screaming and yelling. When good policies happened, it was his ministers. That guy did nothing, and everyone loved him, and you had to smile on that stage. Oh yes, you're such a great ruler. You knew what he was really like, and for decades, you've been waiting until finally you can be the ruler, and finally, you can live up to the vision of what a good ruler would be, unlike what you really know your father to have been like. And finally, you are out of the shadow, and you are the king. But respects you. They associate you as being just the kid of this wonderful, charismatic father who sadly is now gone because they loved him. You knew what he was like, but they loved him. And they don't like you. They don't even respect you. Why not? And even worse, who do they love? Who do they just love to applaud every time he walks onto that stage? Junior! I mean, sure, he's cute, but oh my God! He is the laziest kid imaginable! He's gonna be king? He's gonna take my place? I mean, look at this kid. I mean, sure, he's got a huge smile. Everyone loves him. They love Dad. They love Junior. They hate you. And look at him. Yeah, he's never gonna be a ruler. And yet, he is. Like you can't live forever. Someday that kid is gonna be the king. And everyone loves him. In other words, all of the patterns that you and your father had, with him thinking you the lazy one who needs to be yelled at because you can never live up to his greatness as the great authority figure, you're now playing out with poor Junior. The point being, welcome to families. These patterns, as I mentioned, can last for our entire lives. They can last for generations. Family dynamics can continue for decades while we're alive, and they can just be passed on. And if you're in a system, and sadly this doesn't take a lot of imagination, we live in less of a different world than we would like to think, if you're living in a very patriarchal system where much comes down to heredity, welcome to the patterns that are going to play out for our millennia. Welcome to a basic family. This is a royal family, but this is a family. So how do you break these patterns? Do you have you and Junior sit down and have a nice little chat? From this point of view, I mean, sure, you can chat all you want to, but the idea is these patterns become so ingrained in us, we don't even know we have the patterns, right? And so you're not going to talk through them because what's Junior going to say? Dad, I think you have patterns that you got from your when you were the son of your father and you're just continuing. No. Here's how you break the pattern. You go into that ritual space. And in that ritual space, you are forced. You have no choice. This is why you're being submitted to it. You have to do it. And poor Junior does, but you have to do it too. You're the king, and you still have to do it. You have to go into that ritual space, and you're forced not just to become a different person, you're forced to become the figure with whom you have the most complex tensions. In this case, with your son, but also with your deceased father, because your son, again, is your father. He is literally called, in the ritual text, the corpse of his grandfather. So you were looking at your father, even though it's your son, and the point being, you are forced to once again be in that subordinate position. Once again, be looking up at that guy, that tyrant of a father that you lived under the shadow of for so long. And you're having to look him in the eyes, except the person you're looking at is your own son. Making it clear, not just cognitively, but emotionally, bam. All those patterns are playing out again. And you are forced to be subordinate again, go through that experience again, see the world again from the realm of what it means to be that son and that subject, except now you are seeing it looking at your own son, being forced in that role reversal to see the world again from his perspective. And your son too. Your son too, from a very young age, is sitting on that throne, ruling over his own father, who was not always a good father, as we've seen from our examples. And he is therefore forced from an incredibly young age to get a sense of, yes, the responsibility that comes from power and authority, but also all of the dangers of egotism, all of the insecurities that can play into that egotism, all of the dangers that we know so well from authority. He is forced to feel it. But again, feel it in this as-if scenario, because unlike someone who can become comfortable in that power, lording it over everyone else, he knows good and well he's going to have to get off that throne and walk out of that ritual space and again be yelled at by his father. He knows perfectly well this is an as-if space, and that is the point. The reason they will call rituals these as-if spaces is you are not going into a ritual to be trained to be the person in the ritual. like you're not being trained to be the son of your son, needless to say. You go into this as a space that you know perfectly well as Asaph. You know perfectly well your son is not your deceased father. The reason you do it is you are forced in the role reversal, not just to see the world from a different perspective, but to actually literally be playing out a different pattern from the opposite subject position with someone with whom you have an intense patterned relationship, seemingly unchangeable patterned relationship. And what happens when, sure, you walk out of the ritual space and you start yelling at poor Junior again, but remember, then you go back. You're going back and back and back. And you're doing this with all of your family members. So if you remember, you're doing this with your subjects, people who are seeing the substitutes for the subjects. You were doing it, by the way, with divine figures. You become divine, they become human. You were doing these role reversals with everyone and everything. We'll see later examples of what I mean by that, to constantly break us from our normal mode of seeing the world, but again, much more importantly from this perspective, our normal mode of being in the world, which are all based on these incredibly dangerous, seemingly unchangeable sets of habits and patterns. Now, why would that help? I mean, it certainly would help in the obvious sense, like you hopefully will begin to see the degree to which you are patterned, but it seems as more important than just that. Because yes, you are forced to realize that you are in patterns. We usually don't even recognize our own patterns, and here you're forced to recognize them with, again, often your most immediate family members, where a lot of these patterns will set in and can last for our entire lives. You are forced to feel that, but again, by being forced into another position in those relationships, hopefully you begin to sense something else too. That, in fact, the person you're in this seemingly unstoppably unchangeable relationship, they really are missing. And they're missing. Because you begin to see, looking at your son's eyes, that you're seeing different things there than you would normally see when you're yelling at him as the lazy junior. And he is at least seeing another possibility of you because you're no longer just the tyrannical father. You're someone who, yes, is getting a little overtaken by the insecurities and arrogance of your office. But he sees that. And that opens up the possibility when you're being forced into that space over and over again, and this is true with all of your relations, with all of your family members and beyond, you're being forced to see the possibilities of seeing the world as it really is, which is messy. And yes, based upon interactions and patterns, but those don't have to be these hardened ones that are unchangeable. You can work with them. What would this mean were we to do so? Well, now let me say a few words about that last part of the phrase that I referred to from Confucius. Remember the phrase, you conquer the self by submitting yourself to ritual in order to become benevolent. The same term is often been translated as humane, good, and there's not a good way of translating it for reasons that become obvious as I get into it. But what does this give you? Like, imagine you're doing these rituals. Imagine you're doing them right from a Confucian point of view, which is not just that you're being forced into the ritual space, you are, but the idea is you're trying to cultivate yourself through that work. Where would this take you? What would it mean, in other words, to become benevolent? Well, here again, let me give you an example to make the point. And that example I will pull from the text you read, the Analects. So as I mentioned, this is a text that purports to give us the words and actions of Confucius from the point of view of the disciples, trying to put us in the position of the disciples, trying to figure out what he's doing and why it seems to be working at some level. They're trying to figure out what the philosophy is. As I mentioned, the past 2 centuries of Chinese philosophy sort of working out what it was he was doing. But let me say a few more words about that portrait in the Analects. There's a word that pops up over and over again, so at odds with our stereotypes about Confucius, but it's so telling in part for that reason. Joy. Joy. And joy, I might add, in classical Chinese, it's the same character as music. And this is important because joy in the Chinese tradition is not just happiness, which is more like the example I gave before, someone smiles at you and you feel happy. It's a momentary thing where we're pulled by a moment, a situation that makes us filled with the energy of happiness, but then it changes when somebody else asks, etc. Joy, on the contrary, like music, it's a sense of resonance, right? Music, when it's working, and oftentimes it doesn't, the point of Confucianism is usually we're not experiencing what I'm about to say, but when it's working, the notes are resonating with each other. They resonate with us. They bring out these responses that can be incredible when it's working, these incredible feelings of connection. An example they'll often give in the Confucian tradition is if you pluck a guitar string on this side of the room, a guitar string on that side of the room vibrates as well. And the idea is it's a purely resonant interaction where something happened, something just responds flawlessly to it that brings out another interaction, flawless response, flawless resonance. In other words, not patterned habit, but flawless interaction. Connections that open up all sorts of new possibilities. This is the sense of joy. And he's described as this incredibly charismatic figure, but not in a kind of scary political sense. Charismatic in the sense that he's described as someone who will just walk into a situation, sense all of the patterns playing out around him, sense the dangers of those patterns. In other words, if those patterns were to continue to play out on their current trajectory, where they would take us, and that's often someplace very dangerous in the long run, and then he would just do something to shift those patterns. This do something can literally be straighten a mat and say, let's sit on the mat together. It will be quoting a line of poetry. It will be taking an action. You will simply do something that will shift the context, shift the interaction, bring out responses from people that shifts the interaction such that for that brief moment, people really begin interacting and growing from each other. And the sense is, he, in other words, is kind of doing the equivalent of a ritual when there's no ritual telling him what to do. Like he doesn't go into a situation going, okay, let's do a role reversal ritual. He just simply, he's so good at this. He spent 60 years of his life working this so well that he's just able to just do it intuitively. And the reason we'll describe him as joyous is there's this joyous quality, and again, that sense of resonance. He just resonates with people. He connects with people. People feel they're being connected when they're working with him, and then he inspires them to start doing the same. Putting this in fuller terms, the portrait is one of a figure who, through a life of training himself, at the beginning simply by being submitted to rituals, but then taking on that cultivation process, he has gotten so good at seeing the world as pattern, working with those patterns, sensing how to shift and alter those dangerous patterns, and shift how, beginning with the most mundane aspects of his life, how to actually create better interactions, better in the sense of more intensely connected, more resonant. And in the further sense, which you see in the latter parts of the Analects, and it gets developed as we will see at length in the tradition, is he then starts doing the same in the larger world. If you can train yourself to do it in your mundane life, with family, friends, immediate relationships, you begin to see this at a larger level. You begin to see the degree to which what we just accept as the way humans are in a social world is not. It's a bunch of habits and patterns that have become so dominant in a social organization and so unchangeable that they can literally last for centuries and millennia. However, it really is a messy world, which means once you see it, you begin sensing how to redescribe the world as patterns, where the dangerous trajectories are playing out, and how to begin doing things to shift those patterns, break those patterns, alter those interactions to allow dramatic change to really happen. In his day, of course, that part involved things like breaking down hereditary systems of rule, but, and it's not that so largely be a concern for us too, we have many other concerns. However, the process, you're training yourself to see the world not as simply being what it is. You are training yourself to see the world as sets of patterns, many of which are probably much more dangerous than we recognize, both individually and societally, and you're training yourself to alter them. Now let me say a few more words about those larger societal patterns. because Confucian texts, like a lot of these philosophical and religious ideas from this period, will do reconstructions of the development of the world we're living in. And as always, these are very telling. So here are some ways that these will be done in Confucian texts. They will talk about a putative world of distant antiquity, which might sound at first like those state of nature arguments that we mentioned from the 17th century that's all about forget the complexities of the world, let's imagine isolated individuals battling over limited resources. What is the way that they would come up with a system where they would give away a little bit of their sovereignty so they can live together? So early modern political theory that's all about how you build what we would later come to think of as a capitalist system, a democratic system, an acceptance of forms of authority over us, all about getting rid of the complexities of the world and saying, if it's all about sovereign individuals, how would those sovereign individuals create a perfect order? So in Confucian modes of doing, by now you won't be surprised to hear that's not the approach. The approach is the following. They will say, let's imagine what things were like in distant antiquity. Well, in distant antiquity, the world was patterns. That's always going to be the case. Patterns of energies interacting. And in those patterns of energies, it so happened that at times, sure, it would get cold sometimes, and then it would get hot sometimes, and you'd get a lot of rain sometimes, and then you go through periods when there's not a lot of rain. And we humans were like other animals, but we'll see with some problems. So we needed to eat like all other animals, and so we would eat things that grew out of the ground. And some of them would allow us to live, but some of them actually turned out to be poisonous, so we often die from things that we eat from the ground. And then meanwhile, there are a lot of animals that have things that we don't have, like fangs and claws. And so those things, like tigers, would often eat us, so we often die from those. And unlike animals that have fur, we don't have fur. So when it happens to get cold at some times, that to us at the time seemed random, we'd freeze to death. And then when we go through periods without any rain, then those things that grew out of the ground, even though some were poisonous, but sometimes they would be okay, but they kind of stopped growing, it seems, for periods of time. So then we die because we don't have any food. And so that was the life of humans. Now, this is still a pattern world. It's just a pattern of interaction. Just the interactions are eaten by tigers and eaten poisonous things from the ground, but that was the world of patterns. However, we humans began to realize we could begin to alter these patterns. Like, for example, we could do the equivalent of making fur. It doesn't grow from us, but we can actually make fur. We can also learn. Some of those animals have claws. We don't, but we could start fashioning pieces of wood that we could sharpen to be kind of like claws. And then we can start killing the tigers too. And we can start killing furry animals and using their fur to put on us, things that we would later call clothing. And sure, we freeze to death in the winters, but looking around, there are animals that have shelters. They build nests and live in caves. So we could do that too. Now, we don't want to go to caves because the bears will eat us then, but we could do the equivalent. We could take this wood and build what we can call shelters out of them. And what about the fact that, sometimes it gets hot and sometimes it gets cold? Well, what we could do, going back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, we could actually give names to that and note that there's a general periodicity, a pattern for when it gets hot and when it gets cold. And we can also notice that, sure, things that grow out of the ground sometimes kill us, but sometimes don't. So we can take the ones that don't kill us and start replanting those. So lo and behold, more and more start growing that don't kill us. And then to grow more and more of those, we can now, because we've learned not just to fashion sticks, we can learn to fashion sharp things like rocks that we can make into other instruments. We can start cutting down those trees, not just to make for shelter, but also to clear fields where we can grow more and more of these selectively bred grains. And we can now kill a lot of those tigers, but we don't have to kill all animals because it turns out some animals we can do the same selective breeding. And it can actually be really helpful for us for plowing grounds. And slowly over time, what this meant is we humans altered all of these relationships where all of these various things I just mentioned are reworked. So now the fact that it's seemingly random gets cold and hot, we've made that into a seasonal cycle. We've arranged an entire agricultural process around that. We have reorganized those processes out there that we would call nature, but those processes out there into a new set of processes in which humans become the center of the world, domesticating everything around it for our own survival. However, it then turns out, according to these narratives, some of what I've just mentioned, in fact, all of them, I just won't take you through all the particularities, it turns out are also really dangerous because we are always interacting with everything, and by reorganizing the natural world for us, we alter it too. And it turns out we start creating all of these dangers by the ways that we have reorganized the world. And it turns out we are doing the exact same thing when we start developing things like these rituals to rework our emotional relationships. Some of them prove to be incredibly powerful, and even incredibly powerful for very good reasons for a while, and then over time, it turns out they're creating yet other dangerous patterns that we had failed to know. And therefore, the whole history of the world consists of these endless alterations of the patterns, sometimes for really good effect, we can say, at the time, and even in retrospect, but even the seemingly good ones involve dangers that we had failed to note, that then we have to rethink as well as we rework all of these relationships. That's true for the history of the world. It is true with our personal relationships. Adding all of this up, the implication would be, and here I'll refer to a figure about 2 centuries after Confucius, his name is Shunzi, who will say, we need to train ourselves, and these narratives are in part the goal of doing so, to train ourselves to realize the world we are living in, including what we would call the natural world, is not natural. The human world is not natural. I am not natural. The world around us is not natural. These are sets of patterns, many of them, obviously in the social world, but including a huge amount now of the natural world, have been created, or constructed would be a better word, by us, with often incredibly dangerous effects that we will literally not notice if we don't realize that we are the formers of these patterns, and sometimes, unlike the examples I was given, utterly unconscious, not even thinking about it, just habits we fall into that can become dominant in social organizations. So you are training yourself, just as you are training yourself to see yourself as a bunch of habits you fall into that need to be reworked, you are training yourself to see the social world, and indeed much of what we even call the natural world, as being the exact same thing. The goal being not to return to some undomesticated state. We don't really want to be eaten by tigers, even if that would be possible to go back to that. The goal being, endlessly, whenever in the moment of history you happen to be born, you are training yourself to see that world as patterns, train yourself to see the dangerous trajectories of those patterns, individually and in the larger social world, and ask, how do we begin to alter those patterns so you begin to get interactions where things are really connected? Because the real connection is where new possibilities, great possibilities emerge. The dangers, of course, again, going back to the constant theme, are when those patterns become so based, so unchangeable, that they cease to be responsive to the world, they cease to be, by which I mean all of the other interactions in the world, and therefore cease to allow the constant work of connection that ought to be the basis of everything we are doing as humans. So, adding all of this up, it's a very counterintuitive move they're making. Basically, the move is to say, train yourself to not take it for granted, or not, they would put that as too wild, not take as being natural anything, including what we think of as the natural world. The degree to which we think of the natural world as governed by static laws, and by the way, that's not simply uniquely Western idea, there are actually figures in early China that were saying that, but they're actively responding to, incredibly dangerous. The degree to which we think something in the social world is inherent, incredibly dangerous. The degree to which we think something in us is inherent is incredibly dangerous. Shunzi, this thinker I just mentioned, will go on at length, because this was a problem in his day too, saying how horrible it is in an educational system where we assume people, or rather we even assume, the people involved, that we are inherently good at something and inherently bad at other things. He says this is horrible, because it means if you think you're inherently good at something, you don't need to train yourself at it because you're already good at it. And if you think you're bad at something, you won't train yourself at it because you're just inherently not good at it. And this whole move is, you are a bunch of habits, period. And all habits need to be worked on. It is all training, it is all cultivation, and that is how you need to start thinking of your life. Now, what are the full implications of this in terms of the conduct of life, the goal of this course? What it means is you do not spend your life, well, obviously sticking with the American phrasing, following your pre-given true self. As we say, that's about as bad a vision as you could imagine from this perspective. You certainly do not think, okay, existing social hierarchies are natural, again, as bad as you can imagine. But even in a strong reconstituted form of self-fashioning, from this point of view, it's still dangerous, because even if the self is seen as something you're fashioning, which is of course obviously a good thing from this point of view, it's still the self that you're focusing on. And from this point of view, that's always going to be in danger of falling into some levels of incredible egotism, narcissism, and failure to really interact, because the focus should be interactions and patterns. That has got to be the absolute focus. So what would it mean if you were to put this into practice? It would mean you would be devoting your life to learning to see you, your immediate interactions at a mundane level, and the larger social worlds we're a part of as constructed, probably really, really bad constructions, many of them things that we personally have fallen into, customs that have happened to become dominant in a society, and may be dominant for centuries to come unless they are actively altered and worked upon. Much of what we think of as the natural world is largely a product of human reworkings, some of which we may think are working out well, some of which we may need to realize have worked out in incredibly dangerous trajectories. And then you are training yourself to begin reworking these and altering these. What is the ism that will be associated with Confucianism, and what political view would this result in? You won't be surprised to hear there isn't one. Because what this would mean concretely in 5th century BCE China, or contemporary America, would by definition be totally different. We're born into very different worlds of constructs. But whatever world you're born into, you start there and you begin trying to do exactly what I mentioned. If this is not going to lead to a perfect order, which by definition you never could, by definition, because there will always be patterns, some of which will always be playing out into dangerous trajectories, what we begin aiming for are these sort of momentary pockets where things really work. The really working being where there's an absolute connection. At a mundane level, you'll find them. You can even find them at a societal level. Confucius is committed to the idea that these have existed for various times in the past, oftentimes for a few centuries. When incredible things have happened, then sadly people fall back into these rigid habits and patterns, and it's lost, and then it needs to be done again. And the idea is every new generation is doing this. Theoretically, every new generation could do it and get ever better at doing it. Sadly, humans being humans, we probably won't. And therefore, it's going to constantly fall back, as we've seen repeatedly in human history, into these pre-given social hierarchies. But this is your work for you as an individual. That's a good word to use. I mean, it's probably not for you as a person, a set of interactions, and for you in terms of building a world in which the rest of us, and even including the natural world, could begin to really flourish. And again, in a sense, flourishing means connecting, interacting, not by rote pattern, but through this constant resonance. That, in essence, is the vision that it's trying to bring to the table. Very counterintuitive, but incredibly powerful. And so let's open this up. Although, would you like to respond first or open up first?
I think I'm inclined to postpone what I was intending to say the next week,
Absolutely.
so we can have a discussion.
Sure.
And let me begin the discussion by asking you two general questions.
Absolutely.
So, at times in your exposition, it seemed like the overriding ambition of this of ideas was to replace worse habits by better habits. And at other times, it seemed that the objective was to break habits altogether and have a form of life that was altogether not habitual or less habitual. Which of the two is it?
Yes, so let me explain the ambiguity here. The ambiguity comes from the fact that you're translating these materials into English. And as I mentioned before, translation is not a bad thing. It opens up new possibilities and adds new questions. But here there definitely is a potential difficult aspect. So the key here is everything will always be interaction. The problem is not that everything is interaction. The problem is not that everything is patterns. And the term I'm translating as patterns are literally about 7 different classical Chinese terms that I'm translating as pattern, which means if we're using English, some of those patterns will be better than others, but it's going to be unpredictable what that will mean. Now, the one thing that is predictable is patterns that are unchanging, in other words, that are not responsive, in which we aren't working with the world as messy cells with other messy cells, altering things. When it's a stuck pattern, that's what I'm calling a habit, that's always going to be, in the long run, dangerous.
So some of these interactions are recurrent.
Yes, now I say
others are not recurrent or less recurrent. So the question was whether the emphasis is on the proliferation of the non-recurring patterns, which show a greater degree of responsiveness to the problems before you, or whether there are two kinds of recurring patterns, better ones and worse ones.
Yes, so the answer is number one, but the reason why I keep referring to good habits is you may plausibly think, and quite correctly from this point of view, you might think, okay, but maybe if I re-understand my life as a series of patterns that I need to be working on, I mean, the truth is some of these patterns seem to be really productive for me and have worked out really well. And even if I realize I'm not inherently good at X, at least I've fallen into, and I'll use the word for a reason to become obvious, habits in which that seems to be developing really well. So do I want to get rid of those? Now, the answer would be yes and no. So no in the obvious sense, like it's not that you need to always alter all of the habits you fall into. So in that sense, you're developing better habits. But the reason it's ultimately number one is no habit that is unchangeable in the long run will always be working out well. Because by definition, if it is unchangeable, it means you're not being responsive to the world. And so ultimately, you need to be prepared for even a habit that seems to have worked out great for the first 20 years of your life. It may suddenly, because your lives and the world around us changes constantly, and suddenly that can be incredibly destructive. You won't even see it until possibly way, way, way too late. So even good habits in the sense of patterns you fall into that seem to work out productively, you need to be aware that if it's simply a recurring habit, it's at a certain point almost assuredly going to take you in an incredibly dangerous trajectory. So that's why it's ultimately number one.
So we have in Western thought a series of equivalents to these concerns. Yes. So one of them is brought out by the contrast of the imaginative to the mechanical,
yes.
Right? The imagination.
Yes.
Because everything that we can repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we can embody the formula or the algorithm in the mechanical device. We were just discussing AI at the beginning of the class. And on this view, the purpose of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our time for the not yet repeatable. So that's one of the Western equivalents to these ideas, right? Another you could say is music, because in music, the fundamental phenomenon is the interplay between consonance and dissonance. Everything else in music is subordinate to that.
Yes.
And what is heard in one epic as dissonant is heard in the succeeding epic as consonant. That is, yes. Our ability to recognize consonants expands,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And so what dissonance is only palpable and audible in relation to consonants, right?
Yes.
So there isn't an absolute opposition between the recurrent and the non-recurrent.
Yes.
It's some such set of common of ideas that is intimated in what you were saying. Right?
Absolutely. And in fact, they would
So
use
you
terms
want
very
those.
much like
So you want those forms of recurrence that are maximally open to invention, to imagination,
Exactly.
or to use the musical metaphor, to dissonance,
Exactly.
rather than the forms of recurrence that are closed
Yes.
to this breakthrough.
Absolutely. And let me just give an example. Those are perfect examples for us. Let me give you one of their examples in terms of these narratives, these as-if narratives of the past. And one of the ones they'll say is, okay, we at the time, putatively, let's imagine the period when we begin to invent agriculture, we're clearing the woods, we're killing all the wild animals. It's going very well for us because suddenly we're living in 60 to 80 years as opposed to dying in our 20s. It's going great. So we would have correctly thought, this is a really good habit, to use this terminology. This is working really well for us. The argument would be, that's not wrong. The danger is, of course, then we fell into a pattern of thinking, okay, let's just keep killing all the animals. Let's keep expanding let's keep wiping out all the forests. And we sit at a certain point where we begin to realize, this by the way is not recent, this was said a long time ago, we begin to realize suddenly the entire environment is becoming dangerously thrown out of balance, and we're not even getting proper seasonal change because we've destroyed all the forests. So the North China Plain is literally deforested. And the sense was, that was a really good habit that we fell into simply thinking this is inherently good, and it became clear, no, this was putting us on an incredibly dangerous trajectory that we failed to see. So immediately then you get to say, people saying, okay, we need to start replanting trees in the North China Plain because we realized this seemingly good habit, which again was a perfectly good habit in the literal sense, it allowed us to flourish, but we didn't realize that it was taking on us a dangerous trajectory because we had simply come to see it as obviously good. And they would say, this is the same in our lives, a seemingly good habit, which again is truly good from any standard for lengthy periods of our lives, can suddenly prove to be incredibly dangerous, precisely, getting back to the way you're phrasing it, precisely because we weren't seeing it as endlessly malleable, and we weren't therefore noting when it was taking us in an incredibly dangerous
So
trajectory.
that relates to another Western pair or opposition, which is the tension between cooperation and innovation.
Yes.
So another way of describing what you're invoking here is to say, it's a preference for those forms of cooperation that are most hospitable to innovation.
Yes.
So every cooperative regime is threatened by innovation,
Yes.
because innovation disturbs the claims and expectations arising from the established cooperative regime.
Yes.
And so what's the best cooperative regime? The best cooperative regime is the one that most moderates this tension between cooperation and innovation.
Yes.
And that would be another way of accounting for what you're
Absolutely.
describing.
Precisely.
Now let me ask another question. Supposing this idea that you prefer the forms of cooperation that are open to innovation to those that are not, that it's a discussion in a sense about plasticity and the relation of plasticity to repetition. How would you characterize the desired direction of the before and the after? That's apart from the issue of plasticity, of openness.
Yes.
What else can you say? Is it that the better forms of social life are the most cooperative, the most altruistic, the most benevolent? What is it?
Yes. So, well, they will literally use the term benevolent. However, they mean by it a slightly different thing than what we tend to mean. And I mentioned the term is tough to translate. So let me say a few more words about this term.
Yeah.
So this term, it's Ren in classical Chinese. So as I mentioned, it can be translated as benevolence, virtuous, goodness, humaneness. Even the disciples, as you've undoubtedly seen in your readings, are asking Confucius, what do you mean by this? He's always giving different answers. But when you add them up, I think what it's really a sense of is care. It's a sense that you're trying to sense all of these inner patterns around you, and you're trying to develop a sense of care. for yourself, obviously, but for your relationships, for those around you, for the larger social order, even for the larger natural world. And the care would be, getting back to the heart of your question, that care would therefore definitely involve interactions that are more, that are not predefined, clearly, but the sense would be in terms of sort of what's the push? The push is toward anything that will inspire us to, all of us, to be doing more of the cultivation, more of the training to become more aware of how to be more caring to those around us and how to build social worlds where that is being encouraged, where slowly over time that becomes the focus of an entire social world.
And in the genesis of this, isn't there a distinction between the objective and the subjective element? So all practical ethics, in a sense, is anchored in the norm of reciprocity.
Yes.
A partial expression of the norm of reciprocity is the golden rule,
Yes.
which is in that positive element as stated by Christ. And the negative element is stated by Confucius. Don't do unto others what you don't want them to do unto you, or do unto others what you want them to do unto you.
Yes.
That's the Christian version.
Absolutely.
But so the individual has to acquire, you could say, a second nature. His first nature is his brute nature.
Right.
The second nature,
Self-conquering.
the second nature is a nature that comes from society, from these roles and rituals. But there it seems that there are these two distinct influences. One being the objective. You play the role. You enact the role. That's what I'm calling the objective element. And it's represented in the division of labor in society, the technical division of labor, which is the system of roles. The subjective element is the conscious development of your imaginative empathy, which allows you to attend to the needs of the other. In order to be able to attend to the needs of the other, it's not sufficient to be altruistic and to be indoctrinated in the second nature. You have to be able to imagine the other.
Yes, yes, yes.
And it's the working together of these two forces then, the one that breaks our self-regard on the wheel of this service to others,
Yes.
and the other which increases our ability to appreciate the subjective element, the unique element in the other, which is the gift of art, of our artistic and humanistic education and so forth. Equally emphasized in the Confucianist canon, right?
Very much. And let me talk a bit about how that very tension is discussed in Confucian terms, because I think you're exactly right. It's a key issue of the tradition. So beginning with the latter point, I think you're exactly right. It's really not a sense of altruism. So as we're discussing, altruism is really a sense, I should treat all human beings equally according to some clear rule-based formula.
The altruist does not have to be imaginative.
Absolutely.
Confucian benevolent person must be imaginative.
Precisely. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In altruism, you really don't want the person to be imaginative, as we discussed. It's like you have a clear rule-based order. You're not thinking of people in their complexity. You're thinking of them as simply objects within a very clear pre-given system. So, to give an extreme example, utilitarianism, as we were discussing, it's simply what are the costs and benefits of how we interact with people, and we try to have some formula for statistically seeing, X number of people, you have a better with life in the following statistical measurable way. That's what you do, which, as you mentioned, means no imagination. Whereas absolutely in Confucianism, it's not altruism, it's absolutely a sensibility. It's, as you said, an imaginative work of sensing people in their complexity. So I'll give you one of their standard examples, which speaks to this directly. And again, this is a mundane example, but they love mundane examples. So we will often think, oh, that person's just a mean person, and that other person's a nice person. Immediately, the Confucian response to that would be, that person you think is mean. Again, that may be an empirically accurate statement right now, but it means they have some kind of a pattern that's leading to that. You probably, if they're being mean to you, have unintentionally fallen into that pattern with them. And same thing with that person who's not. So that relationship is obviously better relationship than this one. But again, any patterned relationship is potentially going to be dangerous. And in both cases, you are trying to train yourself to see that despite this pattern that they are in, and you're probably in with them, they in fact are messy creatures. And it takes an imagination to break out of that pattern I've fallen into with them and see that this so-called mean person is, no, they're complex.
But the
Sets
most
of things are
striking-
going on that are bringing that out.
But the most
Yes.
striking difference between the vast majority of Western ethics and the ethical tradition that you are discussing here is it's being anchored in thinking about roles.
Yes.
Because all practical
Yes.
ethics is necessarily an ethic of roles.
Absolutely.
And the roles we perform vis-a-vis one another.
Yes.
And then the question is whether in addition to the specialized responsibilities that attend these roles, you also have general responsibilities
Yes.
that transcend the role.
Absolutely.
Right? But even those general responsibilities are anchored in the roles.
Yes.
That's the most, to me, the most obvious
Yes.
superficial distinction
Yes.
between the Confucianist ethics and the main traditions of moral thinking in Western
Yes.
philosophy.
I agree. And so let me say a bit about roles. I agree. It's one of the things that's striking. And let me bring in yet another element that's so seemingly odd about Confucianism is they will very explicitly talk about hierarchy. And we like to, as you said, especially in modern ethics in the West, we like to think everyone is absolutely equal and roles are kind of contingent and irrelevant to who we really are. As you said, quite correctly, Confucianism is very concerned with roles and they think there is hierarchy. So let me begin with hierarchy and then turn to roles. So again, they are strongly opposed to a hierarchy that would actually say there are some people at birth more intelligent than others. They hate that. That's obviously a huge theme in Western thought beginning in Aristotle. Some people are inherently good, some people are inherently bad, some people should be citizens, some people should be slaves. Confucians hate that, and we're all messes at birth. So equally, we're all messes. So they hate the notion of an inherent hierarchy, an inherent social hierarchy where some people will be aristocrats, some will be commoners. They strongly support meritocracy, not to use that term in America, but a strong sense that
No, but
everyone should be educated.
meritocracy defines outcome legitimacy.
Exactly.
So having the capabilities that allow you to discharge the responsibilities of the role.
Yes.
And that, after all, in the West, ideologically or
Yes.
discursively, is one of the fundamental ways to reconcile democracy with the classes.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
So we're all too familiar with that.
Yeah, although let me get to the difference, which is intriguing. And again, not to say you'll agree with this, but it's an intriguing challenge. So part of what's intriguing, and let me, before I get to the meritocracy question, focus more on the hierarchy of roles, and then turns to how meritocracy plays into this. So when Confucians will talk about hierarchy, therefore, it's not a hierarchy of differences at birth. So we need to train ourselves not to think some people are inherently better at X, Y, or Z at birth, etc. We'll discuss how that plays out in American ways of thinking about meritocracy. But in terms of hierarchy and roles, what the Confucians would say is, no, in terms of our interactional patterns, we are not equal. The description of all human beings as equal misses what we do on an individual basis. We can all say, everyone in this room is absolutely equal. A Confucian would look at us and say, well, no, here's Michael and Roberto assigning a paper to students who have no choice but to turn it in on April 24th, or Michael and Roberto, if they're mean, can flunk you. This is not equal. When you go home, you'll talk to your children. That's a hierarchical relationship. Now, you shouldn't be a bad father, but you were playing the role of a father. We are friends. Sometimes there'll be conflicts between our roles of being a friend and a colleague and a father and a teacher. So we're all playing roles. Those roles over the course of a day will play large numbers of them. So at the moment you're a teacher, when you go home you're a father. You're probably thinking even while you're being a teacher, did I get back to my son about that email? So we're always playing roles. In those roles are often forms of hierarchy. So pure friendships, there's no hierarchy, but even sometimes at certain moments, there can be. A friend has to be more of a interventionist with another friend at a certain moment. So in our daily interactions, we do play lots of roles. These roles often flipped. How to play a role in a given moment well is always a question that usually we're failing at. We're trying to hopefully to get better. And often there are inherent hierarchies, which is why the roles can be so difficult to play. Are we being good teachers to you? You'll have to decide that for yourselves, but that's a constant question. Now, this is directly relevant to the issue of meritocracy, too. So, meritocracy in America, we like to think we're a meritocratic world, and as many people have correctly argued, we are much less of a meritocratic world than we would like to think. So, obviously, if you look at sociological statistics, there is, despite the way we like to think of America, there's incredible little social mobility in America, unbelievably little. We have world historical levels of wealth inequality. That wealth inequality is, again, rarely difficult to break down, either in terms of inequality itself or in terms of who becomes wealthy. So we do not live in a very meritocratic world, but the Confucian response to the current world we're living in would say, it's not just that we don't live up to our ideals, they would have concerns about our ideals of meritocracy as we articulate them. So let me give a quick example of that critique and what it would look like. So the critique would go along the following lines. Even if Americans lived up to their definition of meritocracy, here's what that would mean. We do like to think that people are inherently one thing or another at birth. We like to think that it's a meritocratic world. Again, it's not, but even if it were, it would be a meritocratic world because we would be creating a world where people could fully be what they at birth are able to be, and if they work hard, could be successful at it. So this is why we do tracking in educational systems. We try to track people from a young age. Michael is good at math. He is bad at something else. And we try to track them with the idea that I'm inherently good at certain things and not good at other things, and we want to track them there.
But do they deny that?
Oh, yes, they do. So let me get back to that. But first, let me say a few words about the American vision. They would also say our personality tests, which are really the flip side of the same coin. It's the whole point of a personality test is there are a limited number of categories that can explain all of us. And with the test, you can find out who you really are. And it's often directly feeding into the tracking system in an educational system, because if you are type MXQ, you are inherently good at these sets of things and not very good at those sets of things. The ideal of the educational system, if it's working meritocratically, is if you work hard, you can fully be successful in those things you are good at. And the whole point of all the personality tests, all the tracking, is to get you into having the training you need to be successful in those career options that play to your inherent strengths and push you against going into things you're not
But the
inherently good
defender
at.
of them would say it's also to help you discover your passions.
Yes, exactly. But here, that's a perfect segue to the critique. So the Confucian response would be to say, I'll mention Shunzi, who's very explicit on this. So he's the one I mentioned who says, it's incredibly dangerous to think we're inherently good at X, we're inherently bad at Y, we have an inherent personality, he would say, these are habits we fall into. Again, we can call the ones that lead us to be good at math good habits, but they're dangerous for the reasons I've mentioned. It's incredibly dangerous to say I'm not good at Y, because it means I'll never train myself in it. So Shunzi's response would be to say, what you want is an educational system, and you should have no personality test, I didn't live to see those, but you did live to see tracking in educational systems. You do not want an educational system that would track you, which would also mean you don't want a meritocracy that would say, if it worked, if you work hard, you'll be able to be successful in a career that you're good at. So the whole SAT that sadly most of you, if you grew up in America, you had to take, like you probably learned, I'll make it as a statement, nothing by training yourself to take the SAT. The SAT is an insanely stupid test. It's testing your ability to study to take a test, a mindless test, that if you practice it, you can do pretty well on it. But it tests nothing. But the claim of the SAT, you can trace the history of this, is it's testing who's intelligent and who's not intelligent. And again, the American meritocracy division is the most intelligent ones will go to the best schools and they'll be tracked to be what they are.
So for example, who's good at analytical manipulation?
Exactly, precisely.
And is there not a differential genetic distribution of endowments for that?
I would say it's incredibly dangerous to assume there is. What if, it's not that the tests aren't picking up something, but what if I'm testing good at math? I tested very good at math, so I'm using that as an example. What if I tested good at math because I happen to fall into habits from a young age that enable me to be really good at math and not test terribly well in other things? Now, a Confucian response to that would be, well, if there's some habits that are helping Michael be good at math, that's perfectly fine. Again, the danger of habits are the ones we mentioned, but don't track him so that he won't do the other things he's not testing as being as good at. It just means he needs to be trained all the more.
Let's change the focus. So
it's a very different vision of meritocracy.
So in addition to this differential distribution of genetic endowments, is there not within humanity a distribution of temperaments? Is the objective of Confucianism to give us all the same temperament?
No, it's the exact opposite. The concern would be, and this is why I love your statement of passions, because we love to say this in America, the personality tests assume that there is a limited, I know you're not saying the American vision, it assumes there is a very limited number of personality types that you can all be plugged into. And the fact that we take these thinking this is telling us who we really are.
And some of the extreme of the spectrum are related to learning disability.
Absolutely. Which means instead of saying, oh, this person has X learning disability, that's who they are, you say, okay, what are the things we can do to help them be better at X, Y, and Z? Like the test assumes you already are X, and the test is finding out what that X is. So there are a limited number of personality types, there are a limited number of things people are good at, and a simple test can show that, and then you build an educational system around that limited set of numbers. If, on the contrary, we say we're all messes, by definition, there are not preset sets of categories. Now, in a given social organization, we may, for all sorts of reasons, when we're building tests, etc., come up with different systems of rankings, but if you're telling yourself constantly, this is a construct, we humans are constructing this, then you are much more likely to be able to see the dangers of that construct. Whereas
now,
if you think it does measure us,
let me make one final provocation before we open up. So, in many societies in the history of the world, there has been a particular moral formula, which we mentioned at one point in the past in the course, in which the characteristic formula is that in the same human relations, there should be an element of exchange,
yes,
reciprocity,
yes,
combined with power, so an unequal exchange,
absolutely,
and finally combined with affect,
yes,
an overlay of affect or sentiment on the unequal exchange. In fact, that was part of the ideology of slave society.
right,
The
absolutely.
sentimentalization of unequal exchange. Now, in China, in communist China, Confucius has often been attacked by the radicals as a defender of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. And all of Confucianism is an elaborate doctrinal system to lend prestige and charm to the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. I know that you are antagonistic to this criticism, and I'd like to hear your response to it.
Yeah, well, I am antagonistic to it, although not in the sense that it's made up out of whole cloth. So when Mao is criticizing the imperial system, it's not an accurate criticism fully, because there are many intriguing things I think we can learn from the visions of meritocracy that developed. However, what he is criticizing, and I think with some degree of accuracy, is he is criticizing a rereading of Confucianism that came to be known as Neo-Confucianism, and it's a radical rereading. And just to give you a sense of what the radical rereading was and why Mao was making the critique he's making. So a lot of this, the big figures, a figure called Zhu Xi in the 12th century, who tries to reread the entire Confucian tradition. Now, his view is that everything we've been talking about today is true.
Kind of pseudo-metaphysical.
Exactly. He develops this entire metaphysical system to argue what I'm about to mention, which is everything we've been talking about is true, but only an incredibly small number of people will ever really do the cultivation and training to really become the kinds of people that Confucians were calling on us to become. Most others will never do that. And so since they'll never do that, we just need to keep them in order. And to keep them in order, what we need to do is for us, and he thought he was certainly one of them, so for us people who could become sages, and Jushi thought he was already there. We, of course, will do the kinds of training that Confucius is talking about, because we're going to put in the time and effort to really do it. Everyone else, we will actually create a different ritual system. This is literally true. He actually writes a book called The Family Rituals. It's been translated, by the way. You can look at it. It's fascinating and chilling. So in his rereading of it, he takes out, to give you an example, all of the role reversals. So he will say, for the people who aren't going to cultivate themselves, we want rituals that will train them to be the proper roles, in exactly the way you were using it in the negative sense, that we want them to be. The few who can break out of this are us, but the rest of society, we just want them to live properly in a world that the rest of us can govern as proper visionaries of what, from a Confucian point of view. So Mao's critique, which again is absolutely accurate, is for the vast bulk of society, they are not being inspired to be educated and trained in all the ways we're talking about. That's seen as something a limited elite will do. Now, it's not an hereditary elite, so let's give credit where credit's due. Jushi absolutely does say we should have things like civil service exams that will hopefully help find those people wherever they're born, that will allow them to become like us. So he is meritocratic in that very specific sense. However, it is certainly true. He thinks the bulk of the population will never do this, and let's not even try to get them to do it. And so Mao's critique, and I think Mao's critique on this point is certainly accurate, to say, well, it's a completely hierarchical world, not a hierarchy of birth, because again, Jushi is absolutely meritocratic in the sense I mentioned, but it is an assumption that the vast bulk of people, since they'll never do this, we shouldn't even try to get them to do it. And Mao's critique is, well, once you've said that, then by definition, you're going to create an incredibly hierarchical world, which late imperial China absolutely was. Now, of course, my critique of that would be to say, well, then let's go back to earlier versions of Confucianism and ask, could we build on those for a more powerful vision than the vision I was just describing? But yeah, that's what Mao's critiquing. Yes. Let's open this up indeed. Yes, please.
Tanya, I don't know if you know Tanya Lerman. She wrote the book How God Becomes Real. She has this idea about religion and the human relationship with spirit as a real-making exercise,
Yes.
in which she's essentially claiming that we use imagination and ritual to make gods felt in our world. And so my question is, in what ways does this idea of real-making apply to the Confucian idea of ritual and imagination as tools for fostering flexibility and empathy? And do you think there is a line between religious real-making and what Confucius is proposing?
Yes. The answer is, and is the relationship between religious world-making and the sorts of visions that Confucius is bringing to the table? And the answer is yes, but in a very fascinating way. So in his view of ritual, I was mentioning these role reversals we'll do with immediate family members, but let me say a little bit more about what we might term the religious versions of this. So when, in that example, my father's still alive, so my grandfather passes away, what happens to him? Does he really become, as was thought in Confucius's day, a ghost that I then need to transform into an ancestor by calling into the ritual space, having him inhabit a member of my family and feeding him accordingly? Or does he not really exist because he's really dead? And what about the other things up there? Is there really a heaven that's a benevolent deity? How does all of this work? And Confucius's response is to say, in the ritual space, which he'll again explicitly call an as-if space, in this as-if space, yes, my deceased grandfather really does come down. In the ritual I was mentioning, where's the father? That son's deceased grandfather really does come down. I am looking at my son, but my son really is also my deceased grandfather, or my deceased father, his deceased grandfather, and he's really there. And in that ritual space, heaven really is a benevolent deity that is acting on behalf of us. In the ritual space, that is the case. In that same ritual space, the divine powers will become human. Like my grandfather will inhabit a human body. I will call down other spirits who will inhabit human bodies. We, in that ritual space, when we're dealing with them, we become divinized. So we literally do these role reversals with divine powers too when they're doing them with us in the as-if space. Then, when the disciples push them to say, okay, but what are they like outside the world, I mean outside that ritual space, like are there ghosts up there, are there, is there a heaven up there that's really a benevolent deity? And his answer is consistently, I have no idea. And his point is, it's a world of relationships. We rework the relationships in the ritual spaces where we do the role reversals to rework them. If they are really coming down, they will be reworked by them, and that's great. If they're not really coming down because the dead are really dead, well, we're still being reworked by them, and so whoever is in the ritual space is being reworked by them, and that's what matters. So going back to Tanya Luhrmann, I think you're right to bring her in because she's so fascinating on this point. What they would say, it's in kind of an agreement with Tanya Luhrmann, although they get into it from the opposite direction, is they'd say, well, yeah, you really are speaking to the divine. Now, you're doing that in the as-if ritual space. Is there really divine figure? I have no idea. So it's a fascinating move. Yes.
So the original Confucianism, as you're representing it, as distinct from the Neo-Confucianism
Absolutely.
of the Song, is an anti-metaphysical metaphysics.
Precisely.
Right?
It's beautifully
It's
put. Yes.
naturalistic,
Yes.
and its central idea is that in a meaningless world, we create meaning.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it, and your contrast with Neo-Confucianism, again, this movement that Mao was so antagonistic toward, you're absolutely right. The move of Neo-Confucianism, I mentioned the ritual example, but let me mention the metaphysical example, because they're one and the same for him. So Jushi's vision of the metaphysical world is there is a metaphysics, and the world is fundamentally coherent, and that fundamental coherence means we must learn to live within that coherent world. Now again, in the earlier Confucian view, the view was it absolutely should never be thought of as coherent. It is, from our experience, a mess. Now, again, is it metaphysically a mess? We don't know. Whether we know physically, metaphysically, if there are ancestors, we have no idea. But to our experience, the world is a mess of energies that we are endlessly working with. And so, yeah, I love your phrase. It's an anti-metaphysical metaphysics. It's against developing a metaphysics that we would actually think to be true. It's rather, you think of it as constructs that we are living by, but because they're constructs, you must always be ready to alter them whenever that they become dangerous. Oh, yes, please. Yes.
From the Christian, the Bible talk about the love.
Yes.
In the context, it talk about the Ren.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's also for the role to Professor mentioned. Is in the Chinese society, the role is not from the individual perspective, is from household or the perspective. The
Yes.
role is also is kind of similar role like emperor and official.
Yes.
Father and son, they are kind of it's a similar. The
Yes.
role is not so distinction.
Yes.
Could you is may this bring the different the ethic? I mean is it truly totally different? I think do they have the very common ground? And also the second question, I think is so fascinating that you talk about the sex, SAT, the development through the passion. But in the China, we also have, for the group, we have coaching.
Yes.
That kind of test, so that we call it choose the virtual person to be a vocation. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So I will be brief. Yeah, let me quickly restate it, and I will be brief, but a lot of these are themes that we've been picking up next week. So the question, beginning with the first question, the question was, in this notion of goals, how do things like the equivalent of love work out that we're discussing with Christianity, and how does this relate to, if it begins in a household, what are these passions that we are developing, these emotions we are developing for the rest of the world? And actually, let me answer that one, and then I will indeed just hold off on the second one for the beginning of next week, if it's okay for lack of time. But let me answer that first one, since it's a wonderful way to conclude today's discussion. So Mencius, who's one of the second reader we gave you, so one of the big thinkers who comes after Confucius, has an intriguing response to this that's also very interesting to think about comparatively. So he himself was criticizing a group called the Moists. The Moists were very much, that alludes them in passing. This is the group that absolutely said there is a structured world. Heaven is a purely good divinity that does exist. It's created a structured world for us. It's given us clear ethical principles. Those ethical principles are basically a utilitarian framework. So you should treat everyone, friends and strangers, identical because we're all equal according to a utilitarian ethic. So it's a vision that obviously you've come to know very well as utilitarianism. So Mencius's critique of this is very telling. So his critique of this is to say, well, no, you won't be surprised to hear he's going to oppose all of what I just said. And his response in terms of how you then deal with other people, the strangers, for example, is you begin with the mundane parts of your life, which for most of us will mean your immediate family. That's where you're beginning to hopefully work through these patterns, or for most of us, you begin by falling into horribly dangerous patterns in the family, but then hopefully you begin to work out of them. Then his verb is you extend those emotional qualities of virtue or humaneness or benevolence, however we want to translate this, you extend them outward. And so he's saying, well, you don't say, I will treat a friend and a stranger equal by a simple utilitarian principle, because I'll never care about the stranger if that's the way I'm doing it. The way you care about them is you are extending these emotions that are based upon caring, as Roberto has said, in an imaginative understanding of the other, and you're extending those outwards. And it's a very powerful response to altruism. And then next week, I will turn to the implication